When it comes to evaluating the effectiveness of a given sermon, there's one question to ask that might seem counterintuitive, but it is the most important question to ask. We're gonna get into that today in this video. My name's Lane, this is Preaching Donkey. It's so awesome to have you on the channel today. If you haven't subscribed yet, be sure to do that. That's how you can stay up to date with all the videos that we're putting out on preaching and helping you preach with more impact and effectiveness and clarity than ever before. And along those lines, I wanna give you something for free. If you go to preachingdonkey.com/21days, you can pick up my free 21-day guide to creating killer sermons. It's gonna take you through a 3-week, 3-step process of being able to write sermons and deliver sermons, maybe differently than you've done before if you've been preaching for a while, or if you're new to preaching, it'll be perfect for you. So again, preachingdonkey.com/21days, totally free, my gift to you. When you preach a given sermon, there's all kinds of ways to determine if it's effective or not. And this might be that you take a sheet that has, did the preacher give enough illustrations? Were the points clear? Was there a clear bottom line? That's fine. And we can do that kind of stuff. And I encourage that kind of evaluative feedback. But there's one question that often we don't think about that's far less textbook, that's far less kind of, structured, but it's so vital. And here's the question. When people get in their car and drive away, what do you want them talking about? That's the question. When families get in their car and the husband's talking to the wife and the wife's talking to the husband and the kids are talking to the parents and somebody says something about your message, what do you want that to be? There's really a few things that could be said, okay? I remember when I was a kid, driving home from church was actually kind of interesting because I would hear from my parents' perspective what they thought about church that day. And to be honest, a lot of it was just critiquing aesthetics. Well, I didn't like this song, or that person, or I liked this, or I didn't like that. But there wasn't a whole lot of talk about the content of the message. That's not a knock on my parents. I'm just saying that was the way it was when I was growing up driving home from church. So often as a pastor, I think about what are people saying when they're getting in their car and they're in that moment where everyone else is shut out and we're done with the, hey brother, how are you doing? Great to see you and all that. They're just in their car and they're driving home or they're going to lunch. Number one, does the sermon even come up? Okay, think about that. Is your communication compelling enough that people can't help but talk about it? Does it even come up? Number two, what are they saying about it? If you're fortunate enough for people to get in their cars, drive home, and actually talk about and discuss the message, then what do you think they're saying about it? And so if people are discussing the message at all, the question that we have to ask as pastors is, what do we want them to say? And how can we actually even control that? Well, we can't control it, obviously, but we can steer in this direction. There's a couple of things to consider. I always like to talk about making sure that you have clear calls to action, clear action steps that you give your people at the end of a sermon or during the sermon to say, hey, this is how you can take this message and it can apply to your life. It's a big part of what makes preaching and not just lecturing or teaching. It's geared towards life change. It implies action. And so one of the ways that you can get that to happen is, hey, when you're driving home today, tonight when you're going to bed, I want you to talk about this or discuss this question or this thought, or here's the bottom line, here's the main idea for the day. I want you to take this further. So you could steer in that direction and say, here's something related to this sermon that I want you to discuss. That's one way to kind of steer the direction. The other side of this though, is that really you can ask all day long for people to discuss a certain thing, but if they're not listening, if you haven't captured their attention, if they're not tracking with the message, then it doesn't matter what you ask or say, they're not going to do it. And so what you have to do is, if you want people to be saying and doing a certain thing when they're leaving your message, when they're leaving the church, when they're driving home, if you want a certain kind of conversation to happen, you have to kind of back up and say, is my preaching effective enough? And is my communication gripping enough? And is it persuasive enough that people are moved in a certain way, that there's enough tension that's been built where people can't help but talk about it? And that's a different question. For that to happen, you really have to build in tension in your sermon. You have to build tension into your points and tension into the way that you deal with the text, because tension is what creates change. Tension creates movement. Pressure makes diamonds. I mean, when people are in tension, when they're looking at that going, oh, I don't know, that doesn't sit well with me. I'm not talking about preaching something that isn't true. I'm not talking about trying to be creative and say something that's never been said before. That's not possible, okay? And normally it's heresy. What I'm saying is being able to draw people into the implications of the text in such a way that they go, oh, this is what it means for me to follow Jesus in this way. This is what it means for me to be obedient. And that puts me in tension because I don't know if I'm ready for that. And so if people are in tension, if people have some intrigue, if your communication and your preaching is done in such a way that you make the text appealing and they want to dive into it more so that they're not just walking away, they're not just driving away talking about you and how eloquent your message was and how amazing of a communicator you are, but they're going, wow, I've really got to dig into Romans 12. Because there's so much there. Can you believe that when Paul wrote Philippians that he was in a prison? I can't imagine writing these words sitting in a jail cell. Like, that's the kind of stuff that I just imagine people saying when they're driving away from one of my sermons. And I just try to think, how can I structure this in such a way that they're gripped enough, that they're paying attention, that they're tracking with me, so that when they leave, something is sitting with them and they're walking away with it. Now, the last thing that I'll say, and this is an important thing, even though you can't control what people are gonna talk about regarding your church, your sermon, the day, you can't control if they're even gonna say anything, if they're gonna be focused on it, you can do certain things to make sure that they're paying attention. You still need to ask when you're preparing, what do you want them to be saying? Because that can help steer you to have clarity in your message. Because a lot of times we think, okay, they need to get this, and they need to get this, and they need to understand the text, and they need to get its implications and the points, and I want them to remember this story and this illustration, and all that stuff is great, but people aren't going to remember all of that. And so one of the things that's really helpful is if you say, even in your own preparation, if you say, okay, this is the thing that when they walk away, I want, whether I tell them to or not, I want them to remember and discuss and talk about this thing, this point, this truth, this nugget, this idea, because it's so vital and so important to understanding this text, to life change, to movement. And so if nothing else happens, when they drive away, this is what I want them talking about. So we take all this and put it together. The important question is, when people drive away from your church, what are they talking about regarding your sermon? Number one, they may not be talking about it at all. You just got to think about that. That's a possibility. And you can't control it, and you can't make them talk about it, but in your communication, you can at least invite them in, maybe give them something to think about, or at least communicate in such a way that they're gripped by the message and they want to discuss it. And then finally, in your preparation, if you begin with that question, what do I want them to talk about when they leave? It can bring clarity and focus to your message like almost nothing else can. So this week, when you're writing your message, I want you to think about that question. When people are driving away from my church, what do I want them to talk about? And then let that drive your preparation. Even if you'd never mention it to your people, even if you never give a specific request for them to talk about that, that's fine. If all it does this week is just steer your preparation in a new way, in a tighter way, in a way that's more focused, then that would be a huge win for this week. Try that out. Let me know in the comments how it goes for you. Definitely check out this playlist if you want more sermon preparation tips and advice. Be sure to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Give this video a like, share it with your friends, share it far and wide. I'll see you in the next